Coming up this week, we'll be showing you how to chain SSH connections as well as some cool tricks that you can do with it. Going along with that theme, we're going to have an interview with Bryce Chittister about running a BSD-based shell provider. Of course, news, emails, and house-stay turkeys, all on BSD Now, the place to be, SD. BSD Now, episode 42, Devious Methods, recorded June 18th, 2014. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude.
Glad to have you guys with us on this episode of BSD Now, and we're going to hop right into the headlines this week. So first up, who's up for a slice of pie? Oh, well, wait, maybe not. Maybe some pie and ASLR and FreeBSD. Yep. So what is that exactly, Alan? Let's explain it for folks.
So this is some work going on by Sean Webb, who isn't a FreeBSD committer yet, but if he
soon will be. If he keeps this up,
if he gets all this going, then I'm sure that will happen for him. And he says ever since his presentation at BSDCan, he's been working with Brian Drury to get more things to actually work with the position-independent executable support, which is required to get his address space layout randomization stuff to actually work. So it says normally without PIE, an executable tells the operating system at what address it expects to be loaded. If the executable isn't loaded at that address, things can and will likely go wrong. However, when you compile an executable with this PI support, the executable tells the operating system that it can be loaded anywhere, and it makes and the operating system just does that. Essentially, it turns your executable from a normal ELF ET exec type to a special ELF ET dynamic type.
Sure. So it's more like a shared object instead of just the binary.
Yeah. FreeBSD has supported loading PI executables for quite a while, but the applications that are part of the base system weren't compiled with PI support, so they would always say, I need to be loaded statically, basically, instead of dynamically. And so ASLR wouldn't work for those things. So,
which we want it to work for those things
so
for
now,
security reasons.
We've got it. So we made some certain exceptions that don't, for a couple of specific programs that don't work with it yet. But almost all applications in the base system now can compile with PI. If you just put with_PI equals 1 or yes or whatever in your make.conf and or source.conf, and then i386, AMD64, SPARC64, and ARM will all have PI support.
We need to mention that's on 11 current, by the way, so don't test that on your 10.0 release.
Yeah, it won't do anything on 10 yet. It's not been backported yet. But you know,
but they're issuing a call for testing basically here pretty soon, and they're going to need some FreeBSD developers to look at it and get sign-offs on it.
Some people to grab current and try it with different workloads and different applications and make sure that this doesn't break anything, and then to start working on getting more of the ASLR work reviewed. And also, because Sean wasn't a FreeBSD developer when he started, his code doesn't quite match the style requirements, so he has to clean it up a little bit.
Sure. Well, that's cool. But in the article, we'll have he's also got links to his videos from BSDCan, where he talks about what this means, what it does for the system. And he also mentions that he'll be going to EuroBSDCon later in September. That's over in Bulgaria. So that I'll be excited. I actually want to go sit in on that talk and hear what's going on, and when we can see this in production.
Exactly.
Well, cool. Excellent. Well, of course, we'll have the link to that in the show notes, so take a look if you want to read a little bit more about how that works. Next up, though, we have some pfSense news. So it looks like some hardware news specifically, Alan. They are building some new hardware to sell. So what kind of system they got set up here?
Well, so actually what this is about is their way of testing the new hardware. So they have a bunch of new hardware they want to test, including they're actually apparently working on porting pfSense to run on things like that Ubiquiti Edge Router Lite, that little embedded device. But they sell hardware now through the pfSense store to run your pfSense on. You saw those little like Alix board that they gave away at BSDCan. Those look really cool. And in order to test these, they kind of needed a way to be able to turn them on and off and try stuff and do a
Sure.
little more automated type stuff. So they actually have here the recipe for their little Arduino project. Well, not an
Nice.
Arduino, but something like it called
Mhm.
at Mega, where they actually will be able to power on and off the different machines as they play with them.
Oh, that's pretty slick. So it looks like Jim Thompson posted that over at
Yeah.
PF Sense. So they got some cool pictures, which you guys can take a look at on how they're building that as well, if you're interested in doing some do-it-yourself stuff. But also, there's going to be a little more info coming out on Friday, June 27th. They're going to have another video session for paying customers about virtualized
Yes. So
firewalls.
if you
So
have
that's kind
a
of cool.
PSN support contract, then you can go to their video tutorial thing and learn about their virtualized firewalls.
Mhm. So they also have PF Sense University's got a new paid training course, which was announced, and a single 2-day class costs about $2,000 if you'd like to get set up with that.
Yeah. Well, when the classes are small, they get really expensive like that. There's not much that can
Sure,
be done
sure.
about it.
But still, a
Yeah.
neat opportunity if you guys are heavy PF Sense users.
Hmm.
Okay, next up, this will be an interesting one. We
Yes.
got an article about ZFS stripe width
Yes.
written by the man himself,
Exactly.
Matt Aarons. So, of course, one of the quotes here up at the top, the popularity of OpenZFS has spawned a great community of users, sysadmins, architects, developers. Everybody's contributing a wealth of advice, tips and tricks, and rules of thumb on how to configure ZFS. In general, this is a great aspect of the ZFS community, but Matt wants to take the opportunity to address one piece of misinformed advice.
Yeah.
So let's correct all our FAQs and docs that are out there.
Well,
So we'll
yeah.
go through here. He's going. Go ahead.
It's kind of actually reminds me of a talk that Martin Matruski gave in EuroBSDCon 2012 in Poland. Was that it's like the reason I'm doing this presentation is because there's too many blogs out there telling you to turn checksuming off to make your ZFS faster, and
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
wrong, and you shouldn't do that.
Yes. Please don't believe everything you read on the
Yeah,
internet.
and so on this one's a little more interesting. It's there are certain aspects where if you understand it at this level, you think this is going to make a difference. But if you look
Mm-hmm.
at it from this way, it's not a big a deal. So it talks about
Mm-hmm.
you know how to decide how to lay out your pool, and it gets into a little more
Sure.
detail and has information that you're sure is absolutely correct. Uh, and it talks about some crazy setups too. Like in the one example here, if you had 10 separate storage shelves, so a storage shelf is basically looks like a computer, but it doesn't have a CPU and a motherboard and stuff. It just has
Mm-hmm.
disks and a controller, and it
This.
connects to a head, which is the actual computer with the RAM and stuff. Well, in their example, they have 10 shelves, each containing 24 disks.
Mm-hmm.
And so the recommended layout for that one, not one of the layouts you could do with that one, would be to actually do 24 separate RAID Z3 groups.
Mm.
Basically, one disk from each of the chassis in each RAID Z3 group, so that the if a whole shelf goes away, it's one disk out of each pool or out of each VDEV, and so everything stays online and works.
Nice.
And with Z3, you could actually lose two entire shelves or one shelf and any two disks in some other shelf, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's pretty cool. But it goes through a lot of these different cases. If you're configuring for best performance, maybe on random IOPS, how you want to configure, use a smaller number of disks in a RAID Z group. And then, of course, he goes through other cases like best reliability. You'll want to use RAID Z3 instead of Z1 and architect your groups to match your storage hardware. That's the example you demonstrated there, Alan.
Yep.
And, of course, best space efficiency,
Well, yeah, like
best
for the space
performance.
efficiency, it looks like a little
Mhm.
graphic, but if you click it, it actually is a Google spreadsheet.
It's a
Yeah,
full spreadsheet with all the gory
yeah, it's
details.
like depending on your block size and how many disks in your RAID, how much space are you going to waste?
Hmm.
ZFS is for optimal, it's expecting you to write in the giant blocks like 128K. But if you
Sure.
have a database where you're writing in 4 or 8K blocks, that can end up being a lot different, especially with
Hmm.
if you have say a 4K sector size. If you have a 4K sector size and you're writing in 4K blocks, then every write is actually going to have 100% space inefficiency because you're going to write the block and a parity block, or
Hmm.
2 or 3 parity blocks if you're using RAID Z2 or Z3. Whereas if you do an 8K and you have 4K sectors, then you're going to write 2 blocks and 1, 2, or 3 parities. And it walks through, the differences there and how that's going to work. And so, if you're using RAID Z to get more disk space, but because of your block size, the inefficiency means you're actually getting the same amount of space in the end, then what that means is that you could be using mirrors and getting more performance without actually losing any more space. And so those charts are very handy. And then this other one here kind of just shows how data would actually be laid out if you had 5 disks.
Yeah. What a block. He also has pictures like what the block layouts look like on the disk, which is pretty helpful. It's hard to visualize sometimes.
Especially if you're used to regular RAID where it's always going to be a full stripe. Because it's actually, it doesn't know where one file stops and another file starts. So, right, it's just emulating a big disk and doesn't know anything about the file system. So it just has to write out big chunks. With the ZFS, you're actually kind of aware of the different objects. And so if you have a file that's not very big, then it will only take as many blocks as it needs plus the parity. So you can see here in this example, you got this one where you see there's a parity and only 1 data block, and that's it. Because this is Z1, so you only have 1 thing. So a regular full block, you have parity and 4 data blocks, and then parity and 4 data blocks. And that gives you, that's all 1 file, and you got 1 bit of parity for every 4 blocks. But if your file is only 3 blocks, then you just have the 1 parity. Or if you, and then again, when you have that again, but you see they're offset so that they line up. And then if you only have 1 block, then you have 1 parity and that's it. Or you can have one like this where you have 1, 2, 3 full rows and then a little bit. And then when you get another one that's a full row, it's actually takes up the whole thing. And then you can see there's some X's in here where when a block gets overwritten, we don't want to leave a spot that's so small that nothing could ever be written to it. Because basically, if your minimum data size is 1 block and you always have to have parity, then you're never going to want a single block left over somewhere, right? And so it deals with that.
Sure. Well, one of the interesting things I found in this too, he mentions that at Delphix, he says we store Oracle, MySQL servers, Postgres, etc. He uses all those with LZ4 compression, typically sees a 2 to 3% or times compression ratio. But the interesting part is he says the compression is more beneficial than any of the RAID Z sizing that you're doing.
Reading 3 times less data off the disk means it takes 3 times less time.
Yeah. So that's a good point to have. I mean, you may be shooting yourself in the foot if you're not using the compression in this case. That may be the greatest gain you can make, especially doing database stuff.
And all of your, meticulous math for deciding how, I'm going to use this many disks in my group so that the blocks lay out evenly. And then you enable compression, your block ends up being 3.5 kilobytes.
Sure.
Or 6 kilobytes. And it doesn't line up. And then you end up. It doesn't work like you think it did.
Yeah, definitely.
But yes, compression is a big win now, and there's no reason not to use LZ4 now, especially now that it's smart. And even if you're putting uncompressible data on it, it'll realize it and avoid wasting CPU time trying to compress it.
Correct. But again, fascinating article, lots of cool graphs and spreadsheets, so you can get down to the nitty gritty, find out what may work best for your particular situation.
And I guess the other interesting one was just, when you think about RAID Z3 and you're like, that's so much wasted space, right? But then you think, if you have enough disks in your RAID Z3, we used to be told don't ever go over 11, but apparently that's not really an issue anymore. So if you had 19 disks in your RAID Z3 and you write big blocks, then all of a sudden the inefficiency is down to less than 20%. And, that's not as bad as what you would have paid before for that same thing. Or even RAID Z2, right? It's like, we need that little bit extra redundancy. All of a sudden you're down to 13%. And then actually RAID Z1, it gets down to the point where the percent gets as low as like 6. But you probably want to use RAID Z2 anyway.
Well, cool. Well, next up, we have some interesting news here. We got FreeBSD 9.3 Beta 3 has been released. So I guess 9.3 is on track for some release candidates here shortly. But this is expected to be the final beta, so obviously release candidates next. As far as what was fixed in this, just some small stuff, but OpenSSL has been updated, and the Arc4 random code has been updated to match what's in current. Still isn't using Cha-Cha 20, though, we'll note. But
one of the other
yeah,
big ones was the change that I reminded people to make sure it got in, is the TTY files defaults have been changed so that if the first COM port is the console because there is no video card, specifically in the case of, Beehive. So it's set up so now it will enable by default if it's the console.
Oh,
so
nice.
that
Okay.
means that if you boot up 9.3 in Beehive, when you install the system, you won't get the problem where, you see the kernel message, it boots up, and then when it gets to the login screen, it stops sending you the text. So usually it looks like it hung when it's actually presented the login screen on the non-existent video card. And so,
that's a good fix.
Yeah, I remember asking for that fix back at, I think it was VBSDCon. We started talking about it, and some email went back and forth, and it went into head in January. It got turned on by default in like April or something.
Just need somebody to finish MFC.
Yeah, and so I reminded Nathan Whitehorn, who had done most of the work for it, hey, can we get that in 9.3? And he's like, oh yeah, I meant to do that. And so luckily we got it in time for beta 3, and so it'll be in the release candidate and should be in the release, and that will be awesome.
Oh, fantastic. That's definitely a good one.
Yep.
So cool. We'll have all the links here, though. The FreeBSD Foundation has a blog post as well talking about some of the things in 9.3 which have changed, and there's, of course, a link to the changelog as well. And, of course, we'll cover it once the release version hits. Yep. So before we go, now that we're done with the news, before we go into our interview for the week, though, we want to mention the sponsor for this week's episode, of course, IX Systems. Yep. And that website is ixsystems.com/BSD Now, where you can go there, fill out the form, let them know that we sent you. But before we get too much into that, let's just look at some of the things that's been happening with them this last week. So first up, sounds like we got a YouTube video, Alan?
Yep, there's a YouTube video. And first we'll just quickly talk about FreeNAS. FreeNAS 9216 beta has been released. In particular, this introduces actually the officially sanctioned version of LSI's 12 gigabit per second SAS HBA driver.
Nice.
So MPR, as opposed to the older MPS. And also, it looks like FreeNAS will be introducing the experimental in-kernel iSCSI target, so that you can do that. And they have the new .usb image that they want people to test. Remember when we talked to Josh about that last week?
Yep.
He was mentioning they had some trouble with that, so they want to get more testing for that done.
That's the one where they're using Grub to do that hybrid DVD/USB image.
Yep. They also fixed some stuff with the ZFS replication and made a new VirtualBox jail template.
Oh, nice.
So you can run VirtualBox in a jail on FreeNAS now?
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I know people have been asking for that for a long time, so that'd be definitely a good thing for people to test.
Yeah, definitely. In addition, it looks like Samba's been updated to 4.18 and Netatalk to 3.1.2. Yep. And it says several fixes related to the system data set. So lots of good new stuff in there. And of course, this is beta, so please get out there and test it. Give them feedback so they can correct any remaining issues before it goes to release.
Yes. So then the video you mentioned, Jordan Hubbard, who's the CTO over at IX Systems, has issued a FreeNAS State of the Union. Just talking about what's going on with FreeNAS, what their plans are going forward, and so on. So I haven't actually got to sit down and watch all of this yet, but it should definitely be interesting, and especially if you're, into FreeNAS and using it a bunch, I imagine it'd be good information to have.
Definitely. In addition, we have a press release here that they issued about IX Systems sponsoring the Nzega Digital Library Initiative.
Yes.
So I guess they've donated some FreeNAS minis over there where they're using it to store digital books from international donors.
Yes. So
they're going to be incorporated into their first ever digital library.
Yeah. So instead of, a regular library takes up a lot of space and is hard to maintain and costs a lot of money, but a couple of FreeNAS minis with 15,000 books spread across them, and all of a sudden you have this automatic self-healing system that will guarantee not to lose your books.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that's definitely really cool. So again, these are just some of the things that we're mentioning that IX Systems is out there doing in the community, and they're very active, of course. But
Yes, and
we also want
not
to
just an
mention
open
some of the
source in
main
this
stuff they
case.
do. Yeah. But we could always talk, and you guys have heard us talk about what you can get from them as far as servers go. Obviously, we mentioned the FreeNAS Mini here,
Yep.
which you can purchase a smaller little box, which is
Just goes
great if you
under your
want to throw
desk
under your
or
desk.
under your TV or wherever you want to stick it.
Hmm.
And you can stick a whole bunch of storage in there, a bunch of 3 or 4 terabyte drives in it, and you're good to go.
Yeah, definitely. But they do a lot more than just that. So if you need to build a huge file server, system with tons of cores, I forget that one had how many NICs in it that we
Yeah, we
looked
looked
at a
at one
couple
that
weeks
had
back.
24 NICs in it. We looked at one
Yeah.
that had 80 processors, and then we looked at one that
Hmm.
had 776 terabytes of storage.
Oh yeah, just that.
Remember those
That's
storage shelves we were talking about just a minute ago during the
yes.
ZFS thing? Well, instead of
Uh huh.
10 shelves each having 24 drives, this one has 4 shelves each with 45 drives. Plus, each of the
Dang.
2 heads has its own set of 16 drives.
Hmm. That's crazy. But the point is, they build all of that stuff,
Yeah.
and they can create a custom solution to fit your specific needs for either your personal use or your organization, no matter how big or small.
Yep.
You'll definitely want to contact the guys at IX, and they'll make sure it's customized to do exactly what you expect it to do.
Exactly. When you're building, or when you need a server, you want to go to the guys that build 775 terabyte arrays for fun.
Hmm.
Because
And the
they'll
best
do a
part
good
is
job.
those guys all speak that language.
Exactly.
So, this isn't just some random sales guy who's going to read off a sheet and say, okay, you want this one here, right?
Yeah.
No, 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 no. They'll get down into the nitty gritty with you and figure out, okay, your RAID's going to be configured this way. How can we set this up for you? And of course, they'll do all their fantastic burn in process on
Yes.
it as well to make sure when it shows up, it's ready to roll.
Well, it's like when I was designing mine, I bought a system with like 34 terabyte drives, and I was worried about
Hmm.
redundancy and stuff. And then it came down a question I didn't think of at first. It's like, well, how do we do, or which kind of SSD should I use for the L2 ARC? Like, we
Yep.
recommend this kind. And it's like, oh, well, what if I want a ZIL? They're like, well, for a ZIL, you probably want this kind of SSD, which is different.
Hmm.
They're smaller, but and actually more expensive, but they have more write endurance, and that's what you're after with ZIL because you're writing stuff to it all the time.
Sure.
And it's like, but do you need a ZIL? It's like, what is your type? What kind of workload are you using, and would a ZIL even help you, right?
Hmm.
Because in my case, it wouldn't have, and so they
See?
actually didn't sell me that.
They saved you a little bit of money there.
Quite a bit.
'Cause
Those SSDs were like
something you didn't need to get.
$600 a piece or something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then actually in this system, they also can go crazy, and they have the Zeus RAM, which is basically a
Mhm.
PCI card with battery and a RAM on it, or sorry,
Sure.
RAM and a battery.
Mhm.
And it basically acts as a cache that could, can't even as fast as it can be. Right? It's not even an SSD. It's
Mhm.
just here's RAM with a battery, and
Dumping the RAM. Yep.
that'll back your
That is
writes
pretty cool.
and make your database go really fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, we want to mention the URL, ixsystems.com/BSD Now. Go check it out, fill out the form, let them know that we sent you, and get in touch with their guys there. They'll definitely hook you up and make sure you're a happy customer. Cool. Well, we'll be back in just a moment with our interview for the week with Bryce. Okay, we're joined now by Bryce Chittister, the sysadmin over at Devious, who's going to be talking to us about running a BSD shell provider. Good to have you on the show today, Bryce.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Cool. Well, the first question, same one we give everyone. Give us a little bit of background about yourself. What was your first foray into BSD? What led you to this place?
Gosh, I've been doing BSD, Linux, Unix, you name it, since about 1998. I was in 6th grade at the time, and my computer class, teacher said, "Hey, PHP, MySQL, Linux, this is the future." And so,
Sure.
I went down that rabbit hole, and then I found out my ISP had an AIX host that I could
Mhm.
tell that into, and that's where I really started to gain some Unix ground. Since then, let's see, from there I went to SUSE, then I went to FreeBSD 4.4, and then back to Linux, since Linux was doing better support-wise for the hardware I had, and shit. Now I've got a variety of BSD hosts. I run pfSense for firewalls. I run FreeNAS, or just vanilla FreeBSD for file storage, and OpenBSD for all sorts of other odds and ends. And of course, I now administer OpenBSD, or I mean Devious, which is an OpenBSD shell host.
Cool. So could you tell us a little bit about the shell provider service and how you got involved with it?
Sure. I joined Devious as a mere user back in 2010. That was shortly after it launched. Devious was founded by a couple of guys who are just OpenBSD nuts. They love OpenBSD. Since then, the service boomed. They brought on additional admins, myself included, of course, as well as Kalis Lons, Robin Dietrich, Kyle Isom, Doug Augustin, Joshua Gao, Christopher Michaeljean, and Brian Callahan, whom you interviewed a few weeks ago. Devious is completely free and donation. We just run on donations. All of our admins, we're just volunteers. We're doing it for the fun of it. We like doing it. Hardware and hosting, bandwidth is all donated by the founders. So yeah, we just keep on trucking. We represent OpenBSD, and we cater to OpenBSD. We are, like we like to say, by OpenBSD geeks for OpenBSD geeks.
Cool. So could you tell us what the story is behind the name?
Gosh, I really don't know. That's something that was never
Just
really
a
relayed to
cheeky
me.
name.
Yep, as far as I can tell.
Well, cool. Well, give us the breakdown on how many users, administrators, servers. What's kind of the layout like there?
All right. Currently, we have just one shell server. We've had more in the past. We've re-architectured. You know how life goes. But right now, we have just our main core shell server, and we've got a couple of separate DNS servers. Administrators, we've had 11 total, 4 of whom are still active. That would be Robin, Brian, Kyle, and myself.
Sure.
Users, we currently have, last I checked, 5,684 accounts. That is from a total of 16,811 applicants. So we have a fairly high rejection ratio. Yeah, I think that basically covers the stats.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I guess you already mentioned that it runs OpenBSD. What version and what kind of hardware does it run on?
Sure. OpenBSD 5.4 i386. The machine's got 2 gigs of RAM, so no reason to run 64-bit. 5.4 because the 5.5 upgrade would require a lot of downtime, and we just don't have time for that.
Right.
Sure.
And quad-core Xeon on some fat disks, simply put.
So why specifically OpenBSD over anything else for this use case? Is there any specific things about it you liked that took you that way?
Well, like I touched on earlier, the founders were just big OpenBSD nerds. They loved OpenBSD, the project, its ideals, everything. Whether or not it's the best for shell host, it's not probably the best in my opinion. FreeBSD has, some capabilities, some features that are much better suited to being a shared shell host. And we tried, actually. We entertained the migration, and our users were not happy. So we have some very devout OpenBSD users. It's not that they want a free shell host or that they want, any BSD. They want OpenBSD.
Sure.
Yeah, well, when you develop on a certain platform, having the same stuff everywhere makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And since some of our users are OpenBSD developers, they kind of care about that too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I guess, that's kind of a difference. FreeBSD, the project has resources and provides a shell host for certain types of work. More specific to the project than Devious is kind of just, here's a shell host to do whatever you need to do. But because the OpenBSD project is architected differently, don't quite have that same level of resources, and so that's where something like Devious comes in to fill that gap.
Yeah, and some people just want to have a separate account away from the OpenBSD project.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Something to call their own. They can host whatever. They don't have to follow whatever rules are set forth on
Right.
the projects.
Exactly.
Sure.
So what do you get access to once you have an account? What are the rules?
Sure. Devious users, assuming your application is approved, of course. The basic user is in a class called Shifty. You'll get that. And you get a 100 meg quota for your home folder, and you get a 100 meg quota for your mail spool, and you get public HTML. We offer Gopher as well. SSH, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Email, IMAP, POP3, SSL both, and SMTP, TLS. As far as our rules, we have very prominently on our website, devious/policy. We have our set of rules laid out. And the main ones, we are not your free web host, your IRC bouncer, your tunnel through the Great Firewall of China. We do not permit malicious behavior, IRC bots, tunneling, like I just said. We ask you, keep your usage in check. It's a shared host, so you're allowed to use what you need, but don't just sit there idling and mining or
Hogging
whatever.
all the resources.
Yeah.
Don't
ruin it for everyone else.
Exactly. And we have some tools to keep that in check, but we also want users to be able to do things.
Yeah.
So to that end, no background processes. You can't just detach your tmugs when you're not connected. We don't permit that for the default class of user.
Well, especially with, I guess you only have so much RAM and a lot of users.
We have a lot of users, typically, usually only 100 connected at a time, which we can easily handle, but it's not fair to those who are connected to be deprived by the users that aren't connected.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and number one rule, just don't annoy the admins.
Sure. So what would the application process be like to get an account? How's that work?
It's pretty straightforward. Go to the website, click the sign up link, devious/signup. From there, you fill it in. You follow the instructions, please, people. All applications are reviewed by an admin. It's not an automated system. We are reading every single one of them. If we like your application, we click the accept button that we have on our end, and if we don't, we click the reject button.
Sure.
So, it's
that's pretty straightforward.
It is. There's nothing complicated about it.
So could you tell us a little bit about any automated restrictions or resource limits that you've put in place and how those work?
Sure. Our frontline restrictions, we use login.conf and class-based users. So per process memory usage, number of processes spawned, and number of open file handles are all limited if you are just a regular user. We do have a second tier of users too, which are permitted to run a background process too, but those are granted on a very special circumstance type thing.
Sure.
We have also written some scripts and daemons that monitor the system, see what people are running, how long they've been running it. Notably, our biggest or most well-known script, at least to the users, is called BGKD, background daemon. And that's a Python script that watches every process that's being run, how long it's been running, and whether or not you were connected when it ran. So that enforces our no background policy rule there.
So what's your experience been with troublemakers? First of all, what are they doing and how do you catch them?
Well, the majority of troublemakers are weeded out in the application process. They're pretty obvious. There's quite a difference between an upstanding BSD developer who says, hello, I need this and I would like to, and so on and so forth, or majority of troublemakers who sign up and say, please give me tunnels now. So really, you people are obviously trying to, you're just not here for the project. You're just on a free shell.
Right, I guess, most of the people you're especially interested in having the service are people that would already be known in the community, and so you you'd recognize them and be like, oh yeah, that's so and so kind of thing.
In large part, but we even get a lot of the majority, in fact, are newer up and coming persons who aren't yet on the BSD project,
Right.
on any BSD project.
Mm-hmm.
But they want somewhere to start.
So if somebody does slip in, how would you catch them if they're doing something they shouldn't be?
There are a few tools
Mhm.
that we have at our disposal. Simplest to explain is just humans watching logs, keeping an eye on things.
Sure.
Depending on what we see, if it's just, hey, your script's running a little too long, we'll email you, or we'll edit your cron tab and put a little note there that says, we disabled this, here's why.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we see something much worse, or a law enforcement agency contacts us, we will suspend the account immediately. We take the shoot first, ask questions later approach to administration.
Sure.
Other tools, we have OSSec for intrusion detection. We have a couple other scripts that just watch things, let us know when something's gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I used to run a shell provider, I did a couple things like that. The login.conf restrictions that handled most of it, and then because we were using FreeBSD, we used some dummy net to restrict. Because IPFW can match traffic to the user that generated it, you could say, each user only gets 1 megabit or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
Or, just queues and waiting and so on. I think PF was starting to get some of that, where you could match to a user. I forget.
PF does have some. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale to 6,000 users. It would require 12,000 rules. So
yeah, we only
tried
had
that.
like
It didn't
200
work.
users, so 400 rules wasn't that bad. And IPFW is a little different about rules than PF is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's something we'd like to see, and if we have time, we'll contribute that. But for now, we have scripts that monitor it an old-fashioned way, if you will. Let's see, other troublemakers. Sorry,
go ahead.
I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you. We also see troublemakers on IRC if they're griefing people, or we'll see in reports, gee, that file name looks suspicious. Things like that will bring it to our attention. And I think that's about all that we need and have.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So do you guys have any future plans or what you're planning to do?
Oh yeah, we have lots of future plans. Right now, though, we're sort of in our twilight years. We're pretty busy, and Devious is just trucking along. We don't have immediate plans.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's working, so don't touch it.
It really is one of those cases.
Yeah.
We did stick with OpenBSD 4.7 for a couple of years after it was released. For that simple reason, everything was working.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually, we said, we're just...
As with most shell providers, even being a free one, you still have that kind of uptime stigma, and I guess less so when you don't have background processes. But especially when you're a commercial shell host, it's like, I want to start my background process, and I'm going to come back a year later, and it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Eventually, though, we were just too far behind to stay up to date.
Yeah.
So.
Or, the people want to do stuff, and it requires the new features you didn't have yet.
Oh, yeah. 4.8 and 4.9 of OpenBSD brought in a lot of Unicode support and ncurses support for the Unicode. And people were complaining about that, so eventually we got some time and upgraded one release at a time all the way up to 5.4.
Cool. So would you have any suggestions or advice for people who maybe want to start their own shell service?
A shell service in general, I'd say probably start with FreeBSD and know how to wield it.
Mm-hmm.
FreeBSD has some great tools. Give everyone maybe their own jail, or put everyone on their own ZFS data set.
Yep.
Even just the syscontrol stuff to hide users from each other. That would be invaluable in a shell service.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
So you can make it so that, when someone runs top or PS, they don't see any UID except for their own.
Sure.
Although, if you're using jails, the UIDs, if you're in the jail, it's hidden, but if you're on the root, then if someone in a jail has the same UID as you, it might show up, but that's besides the point. And I guess, the logging classes are very powerful for controlling stuff, like you said, most memory per process, number of processes, and file descriptors. Especially, when I was doing it, it was for IRC servers, so limiting file descriptors was limiting how many users they could have connecting at once and things like that. And that was basically our feature discriminator. It's like, you pay more and you get more file descriptors.
Cool.
That's smart.
Yeah. And then, IPFW user matching rules so that you could do stuff, with almost any firewall, you can do stuff like that. But, if you don't want to allow IRC, you can block certain ports outbound and stuff. Also, FreeBSD has the RCTL stuff. So you could actually say, this user or this class of users can't ever have any process use 100% of a CPU. You could just, limit their process to using 25% of one CPU or something like that. And then with that, kind of make sure that you're controlling things like that. Although you also have the option in the login.conf, I think, to set a maximum amount of CPU time a process can take over its entire life.
Yes.
So once a process has used so much CPU, whether that's all in the last 5 minutes or over the course of the last month, you can kill it when it uses too much.
Yeah, you're done at that point.
There's even actually just the accounting system where you can count the amount of CPU time that each user has used and get a report at the end of the month or at the end of the week or whatever. And just, as an administrator, that's a powerful tool. And you can even, it was designed back for the original Unix stuff, so you could actually charge people for the number of hours they were logged in over SSH. But that doesn't really apply the same, but you get the idea. It has these features left over from the kind of mainframe days that just really fit a shell provider.
Absolutely. And, we do actually keep an eye on the system accounting, and anyone who's been using a little bit much, we dig in. We look at what they've run, what they're hosting, that kind of stuff. Touching on a previous point. Other things, you're starting your own shell service, test it thoroughly. Shouldn't need to say that, but it's a good point to say. Version control for any scripts you write, configuration files, everything.
Also,
you want
documentation for those scripts, because someday you're going to be too busy and somebody else is going to have to do something. And, having those in a version control somewhere and having documentation is a big win, because I remember I took over a Unix system at the college when I was a professor there, and there were little scripts buried. Basically, they had a student work on it every semester. So over this set of different home directories, there were little scripts that did things. And you upgraded the version of the OS, and then all of a sudden, one of those scripts isn't doing something, and nobody notices until 2 months later, and it's like, that system we use for exams isn't working. Yeah. Nobody knows where it is or what's going on. That student isn't here anymore. It's just, Yeah.
And beyond that, be open and transparent. FreeBSD, OpenBSD, all of these open source operating systems in general, they're built on being open. So,
if you make a cool
what do you
tool,
have to
share
hide?
it.
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps someone will say, hey, you could actually lock things down a bit more, or hey, I bypassed your security, and you want to know that.
Well, you could, you can always do a little thing, have a bug bounty, whether that's $5 or just getting your name and the message of the day when people log in. It's like, hey, thanks to so-and-so for not breaking things and telling us about it.
Yep.
And probably my last thing is, if you are looking to make a profit, you're not going to have a good time, because
not anymore. No.
Not in this day and age.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's just the world has changed, and some people see a shell service as a get-rich-quick scheme, and it's not.
It wasn't even 10 years ago. It was a lot of work. It was possible to do some stuff back then, especially when people started dial-up. Things like IRC bouncers made a lot of sense for them, so it could allow them to just be able to reconnect without having lost everything and have that little bit of a buffer. Or just, if they wanted to run some kind of service, they didn't have a giant cable connection with a fat upstream at home, right? And so being able to have something that would just stay up all the time was useful. Or, you had dial-up ISPs, and, you want to be able to change ISPs, so you need a mail service somewhere. And, there weren't very many free good ones back in the day, especially ones that you could access with a client over like IMAP, right? Like,
sure,
you never used to be able to access your Hotmail or your Gmail via IMAP. You had to, use their clunky web interface or have a shell.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, nowadays there's not as much market for it anyway. There are a couple of the
it's just a fun hobby.
there are a couple of the big providers from 10 or 15 years ago that are still around. Actually, Brian Drury still works for one of them. Hopefully we'll get to talk to him about that. Maybe get from the commercial side and see what's different, and they use FreeBSD. So.
Yeah, very cool.
But I guess, was there anything else you want to mention before we let you
go? No, just go Devious. We're a good gang of admins, if a bit vindictive sometimes, but we're a solid host, and we look forward to running for many years to come.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us today, Bryce.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, next up, we're going to be going into our weekly news roundup. But before we do that, we want to mention our other sponsor for the week, which of course is TarSnap. And before we get started, let's just mention the URL. That's tarsnap.com/BSD Now. Go there, get signed up. It's worth it. You need to get your data backed up, no matter how small or big. It's important that you have something stored offsite. And what happens if the house burns down, or freak meteor strike, etc.
Yeah, and TarSnap is actually really easy. So if you go to their Get Starting page, you can see that all you have to do is sign up for a TarSnap account, then install the TarSnap client, which will be in the package manager on whatever OS you're using, most likely. Then deposit funds in your account, $5 or more, and you out of that balance you get billed for your usage. And when your balance gets low, you get an email reminding you need to give them more money, or they will delete your files. And then 4, you have to register machines. You have to say, this key file is allowed to access my TarSnap. So you run the TarSnap keygen app, and then it'll authorize that machine, and you'll be away.
Well, the best part is there's no fixed or minimums either.
Exactly.
So if you're only using 10 cents a month, you're using 10 cents a month.
Yeah, and your $5 will last you a long time.
Yeah, definitely. So really, really cool. They said many users have hundreds of archives, but pay less than $10 a month. So that's a great deal for the price. I mean, you cannot go wrong.
Well, yeah, because with
using TarSnap,
the deduplication, not only do you save bandwidth, but you only pay the storage price of the actual usage. So you're not paying for the logical size of all those archives, but rather the actual size.
But one of the best things, aside from the price, of course, is the fact that everything's encrypted in such a way that the remote side doesn't have access to whatever it was you uploaded.
Exactly.
Only you do. That's where other offsite solutions may mess you up.
Yeah.
So if you really do value your privacy and the security of whatever it is you need to back up, you definitely need to take a look at TarSnap. And of course, being open source, don't take our word for it. Go look at it.
Exactly. You can take a look at the client code and see everything that's going to happen, and even compile it yourself if you want to do that. And I guess the other thing to mention is make sure you don't lose your keys, because those are the only keys that can access the files, and TarSnap cannot help you if you lose the keys. That also means they can help someone else if they decide they want your keys.
Correct.
Even if the someone else is the NSA.
Well, good deal. Of course, we have a link here. As Alan said, the getting started is tarsnap.com/gettingstarted.html. So check that out.
First section under documentation on the website.
Walk you through it.
And you can see that it's just 4 steps. Sign up, download the client, give them some money, and then authorize your machine, and you're away.
Away you go. Sweet. So again, tarsnap.com/BSD Now. Let them know that we sent you. We would appreciate that. So let's get right into the news roundup now. So first up, we have my FreeBSD adventure from linuxquestions.org. We have a Slackware user who decides to try out BSD and is documenting his initial impressions and findings. So I have a slight bone to pick with the article here, because in the forum post he said they didn't consider using PCBSD due to demanding hardware requirements, whatever that meant. But I'd like to point out we don't have any demanding hardware requirements, more so than FreeBSD. It just depends on what you install.
Yeah.
So
I guess the only requirement is AMD 64.
Yes. That is true. But I think specifically they were looking at RAM usage and stuff, and it's like that. There's nothing we're running different from FreeBSD, which would cause us to use more memory. I mean,
Nope.
we use ZFS,
Which,
so
and
if you use FreeBSD with ZFS, same thing.
exactly, same amount of memory. And
Mhm.
ZFS can be tuned. If you don't, if you think ZFS is taking too much of your RAM, you can tune it down. You will just
Yeah.
not get as much performance, and
Mhm.
that's a trade-off. And I guess, yeah, so PCBSD out of the box will use more RAM than FreeBSD out of the box, but FreeBSD out of the box doesn't let you use your mouse.
Yeah, true.
Right, there's
We just
there's
have all
no
that stuff
X at all
preset
by
up.
default. So obviously PCBSD when you first start up has X, but the
Mhm.
great story about this actually. So this week was the first week that one of our employees started working at our office instead of from home, because we've actually got an office set up now. And so the machine I provided him with was a fresh install of the PCBSD 10.0.2 release candidate.
Mhm.
And it had all the tools he was used to. He's got, Firefox and Thunderbird, Skype, FileZilla for FTP and SFTP. And then, I installed the Subversion plugin for Dolphin so that he
Mhm.
could just right click in the directory and do stuff because he's used to Tortoise SVN on Windows.
Sure.
And then Komodo Edit and Eclipse. And, at that point, he was like,
That was
how
all
is
it
this different than my Windows machine now?
Yeah, you're in good shape. Well, cool. Well, I think the other side of this too, somebody mentioned was they were looking at top usage. Have you run into this with Linux users on TechSnap, Alan, where people look at top and freak out and say, "Oh, I don't have as much free memory,"
Yes.
kind of ignoring the inactive
And yes, the fact that
side of that?
that there's a great quote for that one. It's free
Mhm.
memory is wasted memory.
Correct. So BSD, is going to report that a little bit different
Yes,
too.
because it's
So
not
I'd
going
like
to
to
leave
mention
the
that.
memory free doing nothing. It's going to use it as cache, and that will make things faster. It's a
Mm-hmm.
good
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Correct. So anyway, just wanted to throw those
Yeah.
bones out
So
there.
mostly
This
just
doesn't have anything to
look
do
at
with the
active and
article.
wired, and as long
Mhm.
as those aren't all of your RAM, then you're fine.
You're in good shape.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, getting back to actually what he wrote,
Yeah.
now that we set some of that straight, he decided to start off with a free BSD 10. He said he declined NetBSD due to politics. Not
I
sure
have
what
no
he
idea
meant
what
there.
you're talking about.
No idea what that's all about. He also mentions trying OpenBSD later.
Mhm.
But in the forum post, he's covering documentation on how easy it is to make it for a switcher, dual booting, packages versus ports, net config, some other little things, which may be helpful if you have Linux users who are considering switching. So far, it seems like he's really enjoying BSD, though, and thinks it makes a lot of sense compared to Linux. So this looks like an interesting series. We may be following up with this in later episodes.
I just saw he's got a question here. He's like, he could mount his FreeBSD UFS partition in Slackware, which shows up as
Mhm.
XBSD or whatever. But he has a ext3 partition he uses to share between his Linux installs, and he's wondering if he can mount that under FreeBSD. He says it doesn't look like there's something built in, and I know that there isn't, but there's a port that'll let you do ext3, right?
Yes, there is. I think
Well,
there
actually,
might even be some fused ones too.
Yeah, I think you can do ext2, and so you could mount the ext3 as a 2.
Read only, I believe.
Yeah, it'd be read only, or if you did write to it, you would need to FSCK it in Linux to reconstruct the journal or something like that.
Mhm.
But you definitely could read only as by just using the ext2 tool that built in, or yes, there's a proper ext3 thing, possibly fused in the ports tree. Actually, I think you can even do ext4 from the ports tree.
I believe so. So cool. Well, we'll see if we can check in with that in a future week and see how his experience is hashing out there.
Yep, he seems he said he had no trouble installing Vim, Tmux, Bash, sudo, etc.
See, it wasn't as scary as they probably thought at first it would be. But good deal. Well, next up, we have even more BSD CAN trip reports are still trickling out.
Yes.
So who's this one from, Alan?
Li Huan Su. I forget his name on IRC. I realized after reading his trip report that I was there for some of the discussion he's talking about.
See?
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. It sounds like he went to the Java working group and stuff. Man, I'm just still bummed I missed some of this stuff.
Well, I missed half the stuff and I was there. You can't go to it all even if you were there. So you would feel almost as bad even if you had been there, because you still would have missed half of the stuff.
That is
or
true.
even
You can't be
technically
all places at the same
2/3
time.
of the stuff, because there was 3 things going on at once at all times, plus the hallway. It's like, yeah. But yeah, he mentions getting there, working with Craig Rodriguez from IX and Julio Marino to get Jenkins and Kiowa put together and doing cool stuff. Working with Mark Johnson to get the AXGE, which is a USB 3 10 gigabit Ethernet adapter. Getting
Nice.
the USB drive for that working and improving performance with
Fixes.
it. And there's some problems he had run into, and then Mark showed him dtrace, and he was like, "Oh, yeah," and he was like, "I need some of that." And then yes, he went to the Java working group. He talked with George Neville Neal about getting more people to develop and support their software on FreeBSD. So, obviously we want more stuff in the port tree and get help from people that are actually building apps to do that, but also just getting more people to use FreeBSD as the base they use to actually build applications, because it has all the tools like dtrace and all the infrastructure is there to do a really good job.
Nice.
And he was showing George the Travis continuous integration system, which is used a lot on GitHub, and talking about how having something similar, like a combination or a hybrid of like that and red ports, so that people that are trying to build packages to work on FreeBSD could test them more easily. And, what some of the trade-offs with that would be. And then he said on the second day, that
was all just the first day.
Kiowa stuff,
Tired already.
looking at the documentation translation stuff, and in particular looking at translating the docs into traditional Chinese. And then someone else, he managed to find someone else on the mailing list that also wanted to do that, and started some of the work and did a big commit to convert all of the existing Taiwanese translation from the old Big 5 to UTF-8 so that it'll render properly in newer stuff. So there's work going on there to update the Chinese handbook as well.
Nice.
And then on to the conference. He loved that line from Carl Lienbauer's slides. $1 billion plus Linus is not as good as people with rigorous engineering process doing BSD.
Amen to that.
Yep. Luigi Rizzo's talk about Open vSwitch and NetMap and all the software-defined networking stuff, and even how to port Linux kernel stuff into FreeBSD, and also how netlink sockets work in the FreeBSD kernel.
Sweet.
Patrick Kelsey about the libuinet, which is basically the FreeBSD TCP IP stack moved to userland, so you can do evil things to it and test it, and make changes to it and test that without actually having to reboot and a new kernel all the time. Lots of interesting stuff there. And then, hooking that up with NetMap to make it really fast. And then he went to PJD's talk about Capsicum and Casper. And, lots of other stuff that happened.
Yes, definitely. Well, it's a good read. Definitely see some of the things you might have missed and what you need to go check out next year, what your experience could be like at a future BSD CAN or BSD event in your local area.
Yeah, and then there's ARM stuff, Test Suite, ZFS, ASLR. And
he even mentions the food.
Yeah.
So come on, lots of detail here. Good stuff.
And it turns out that him and Peter Wem were on the same flight and got to sit with each other on the plane and keep talking.
That is true. Usually the first couple flights out the next morning at BSD CAN, it's all the guys from the conference. So you get like a whole nother round of talks right there just waiting.
Remember Malta?
Yes, I remember Malta.
Yeah, there was
that was a long flight.
Lufthansa. Oh, you were on a different flight, were you?
Yeah, I was on a different flight. Yeah.
There was a Lufthansa flight from Malta to Frankfurt, and there were like 60 people from the conference on the plane. We just like the entire section of the plane. It's like I sat across from me was Scott Long and his wife. Like a couple rows behind me was I think Jordan and his wife, and it was like Kirk and Eric over there, and there's Rake and Henning, and they're just BSD people everywhere. And then somebody was
everywhere you turn, you're bumping into a BSD committer.
Yeah, well, it was more along the lines of, you've heard of the bus factor before, right? Well, if that were this particular airplane would decapitate all of the projects.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Well, next up in the news roundup, we have FreeBSD disk partitioning from our friend Michael W. Lucas.
Yes.
So I guess he opened a can of worms this
Yes,
last
he
week.
asked some questions on the FreeBSD hackers mailing list about, now that we have Gpart, is there ever a time you might still want to use the old tools?
FDisk versus
and
GNOP versus Gpart, etc.
So Gpart versus specifically FDisk and disk label. And is there ever a reason you might still want to use them? If not, then he probably wouldn't have bothered putting them in his book, because there's no sense telling people how to use the old tools that have been, Gpart's been around since like FreeBSD 8 or sooner. And then people brought up some stuff and they're like, well, I still use it. And it's like, yeah, but is there a reason why you still use it, other than it's just what you're used to?
Is it just muscle memory at this point, or is there a technical reason why you have to
talk about? I think it's with FDisk, you can force it to do things it shouldn't. And it's like, well, that doesn't seem like a good thing to be teaching people in the book. So, but
the best part is he summarizes.
Yeah, well, specifically, the thread goes on for something like 500 emails or something. I was only there for part of it, I think. But I'm in there as well. But luckily, yes, he simmered it down after reading all of that and coming to some conclusions, and talks about some stuff. And more specifically, it's like, if you use 4K sectors, then if you use 4K sectors on a 4K drive, it'll be good. If you use 4K sectors on a 512-byte sector drive, it won't hurt anything. But if you use 512-byte sectors on a 4K sector drive, it'll be horrible. But if you use 4K sectors on a 4K sector drive and your partitions are offset, so that when you write 4K, it's half in this sector and half in that sector, it'll be as if you were doing it wrong. And so it's important to line the stuff up. And then it talks about the easiest ways to do that.
That's cool. Also covers some stuff, MBR versus GPT.
Yeah, or specifically how you have to do the alignment when you're doing MBR and BSD. Because you have a BSD partition inside the MBR partition. And the MBR one is forced to be aligned to a cylinder, which might not land on the 4K sector where you need it. So you create the MBR, and then inside of it, the BSD partition where you're actually going to put the UFS, you make sure that's aligned.
That has to be specifically.
Yeah, and then that solves your problem there.
Cool. How to handle them, which tools, etc. So I'm looking forward to the book when it comes out. That'll be a good one to read.
I've been suckered into reviewing it, so.
Oh, nice. Okay. Maybe you can sneak me a copy of that, Alan. That would be cool.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Okay, next up we have a BSD router project version 151 has been released. So this one's based on FreeBSD 10 stable now instead of 10.0.release.
Yeah, they wanted to pull in a bunch of the newer fixes and get all that stuff. They have support for running in Hyper-V now.
Okay, cool.
They have added some extra patches that aren't even in 10 stable. Specifically, pfSense has a patch that sets the maximum threads for the networking stack to be based on the number of CPUs you have instead of a default, which obviously makes a big difference, and also helps with the polling, which allows the instead of the network card raising an interrupt every time a packet comes in, instead the kernel will just ask the network card 1,000 times a second, or whatever your kernel hertz is, do you have any packets for me? And that can reduce the interrupt load a lot. Now, a lot of newer NICs will have things like interrupt moderation to deal with that anyway, but it's an interesting feature. They also have a PF UDP NAT patch that solves a problem with UDP packets in NAT and PF. A fix for the Realtek 8111G NIC that was causing that NIC not to work how we wanted. The BSD SNMPD, there's a cosmetic patch that improves some things. A new multi-threaded version of NetBlast, which is a packet generator for testing your network, and also fixing NetMap's packet gen checksum bug, so that if you're using NetMap package gen, you get packets that don't have an invalid checksum. They also changed some defaults, including turning off the SSHD by default.
Oh, okay. And
they bumped the size of the RAM disk used for /var to 20 megabytes instead of, I think it was 10 before.
Oh no. Well, of course, you can check out the SourceForge page link for a complete list of the changes. And also, we'll mention the minimum disk size requirements has been increased to 512 megs. So It's getting a bit larger.
Mhm.
That's not still bad. I don't know. TJ thinks that's a little big, I guess.
I think
but
that was meant to be sarcastic because it's half a
yeah,
gig.
yeah. I don't know. 512 megs.
Yeah. But you know,
But cool.
it's meant to be run on a smallish kind of machine, and
Mhm.
basically it's not meant to compete with pfSense, right? pfSense is meant to be your firewall at here or there.
Sure.
It's meant to replace, a D-Link or a Netgear or whatever.
Mhm.
Whereas the BSD router project is designed to replace a Cisco.
Yes.
Specifically, it does BGP, and it's set up to do IPMI stuff, and just I think it comes with default. Like when you log in, you don't get a shell; you get the net shell that takes Cisco commands, right? So it's even
Okay.
somebody that's not really familiar with
Used to,
BSD but is
yeah.
used to Cisco will be able to navigate and configure the system.
Oh, that's a nice feature. Well, cool. Okay, well, that's our weekly news roundup. So we'll be back in just a moment with feedback and questions from you in the audience in just a moment. Okay, and we're back with our questions and answers for the week. Feedback from you in the audience. So first up is from Fongaboo, question about ZFS. So I'll go ahead and read it and let you do the answer for this one, Alan. But he said, first of all, I really enjoy your ZFS tutorial. It really demystified a lot about ZFS for him. He said he ran into 2 snafus he's wondering if we can clarify. First, I get a broken pipe when I'm trying to use ZFS send, and then he prints the command here. But he noticed in the video that we did also, even though we didn't make a note of it. So you want to answer that one first, Alan, before I get into the second part?
The broken pipe was caused in the video because I hit Control-C because I didn't want to sit there and wait for it to do it all.
Sure.
Normally, when it'll say broken pipe, there'll be a message higher, like
Some
earlier.
reason why.
There'll be an error and then the broken pipe. Or just check on the other side and see. Depends on your configuration of sudo. The default config on PCBSD and on Linux for sudo makes it so that if you don't have a TTY, it won't let you run sudo. So that you can't run it, as a pipe like this. And I know when I wanted to replicate stuff to my PCBSD desktop, I had to change the options for sudo to say, hey, don't require a TTY, because sometimes I actually need to sudo without it. Also,
he said,
we haven't done a tutorial on it yet, and we should. But using ZFS delegation, you can actually allow replication without needing root. So you can actually just assign your Fongaboo user the permissions to be able to do ZFS replication without needing root, and that's actually a much more secure way to do it.
If you look at the PCBSD wiki, our handbook, that's actually what we recommend in there. And that's what I do to my FreeNAS box. We set up a user, and I don't ever SSH in as root. That feels dirty and wrong.
Yeah, well, he's SSHing as a regular user and then sudoing to root, but it's almost as bad, because if now if you've locked your sudo down so they can only run ZFS, that helps, or only ZFS receive or whatever. But it's better to run it as the regular user and have ZFS enforce its rules, because it'll do a better job.
Correct.
But if you're going to use sudo, you should buy Michael's book and learn how to do it, because you're probably doing it wrong.
The correct way. Cool. Well, he says, secondly, when he deletes file 1 and runs zpool status on Fongpool, it still shows, of course, the device there. So, you said you replied to that in email?
When in the example here, we created a virtual pool of 4 files off a disk instead of using real disks. And then to simulate the failure, we deleted one of the files. Of course, ZFS won't notice that until you try to write or read from that file and it gets an error. So if you do something to the pool, like try to run a scrub or try to write a file to the pool, then it'll be like, oh, hey, that disk is gone. And then it'll switch offline or fault it or whatever. And
failure mode or whatever.
And you'll be able to simulate your failure. It's just because it's not touching the file, it didn't. Unlike a hard drive, it doesn't get an event saying, hey, that hard drive went away.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, hopefully I answered all your questions there. So next up, we have a question from David about package NG. He says, hello there. First, thanks for the show. BSD really needed a bit of media coverage, which I know Alan and I are glad to help provide that any way we can. So now on to his question. He asks if there's any way to set up a local caching proxy for package NG. So he uses the example. He says in Linux they have apt cacher, and also Nginx works great as long as the upstream mirrors are not changed that often. So he says it would not seem fair to FreeBSD to just circumvent their SRV records based on load balancing. On the other hand, isn't FreeBSD and package ng used in large installations where the traffic for package updates starts to matter?
Yep.
And you wouldn't want wildcard access to the net.
Right. So package ng is actually using fetch, or rather libfetch. So there are standard environment variables you can set to define a proxy.
Sure.
And that proxy can then be your Squid or Nginx or whatever you want. And yeah, so it'll support a bunch of machines that maybe don't even have a direct access to the internet and have to go through a proxy. And whether that proxy does the caching or not is up to you. So yeah, setting up Squid or whatever to do a caching proxy, and then make all your package ngs use that by using the environment variables, or sticking the things in your
dot profile or whatever. That's how we do it in our GUI utils. If you set up a proxy, it just splats those environment variables so that when you log in, they're set
I'm trying
transparently.
to remember the name of the man page for the package config file. I think it's just package.conf or something. Yeah. So if you man package.conf, you'll get a list of all the different variables, and there's the stuff for the.
Does it show all the proxy ones? Because I just do man on fetch, and it shows
so you might have to man fetch to see the proxy stuff.
Like FTP proxy, HTTP proxy, etc.
Yeah.
You can
take a look at how you would set those. Basically, if you've already configured your system that way, it'll just use your existing stuff. So if you look at fetch, you'll see there's all the environment variables that you can set to define things like also a timeout, even just how easily you want it to give up. If you're on a really slow network, maybe you want to make that longer or whatever, and you can control how which certificate authority file it's using to verify certificates and all the fun stuff.
Yep. So man3 fetch will give you, if you go down to the environment section, there's a lot of gory details. I think that's what we used when we wrote our util.
Yeah, and so that's actual libfetch, which is what
which is what package ng is
using. You can see the environment variables you can set and control all of the.
You can get some advanced stuff too, like no proxy. If you want to say use the proxy for everything except these URLs or whatever, you can get as fancy as you need to.
And there's even support for using auth or whatever if you have to log in to do stuff, or changing the user agent if you want your machine to show up as a certain way, or whatever you want to look for.
Cool. Hopefully we answered your question there, David. If you end up setting something up, or write us back on how you did it. So maybe we'll turn that into a tip for other folks.
Yeah, I've not had to do this for two reasons. A, I have my own package ng repo, and B, my servers are all spread out, not in one place, so I can't just cache somewhere.
Sure. Okay, and next up, we have a question from Christian, who just wrote this in, I guess. This just came in today. Question about compiler risks. I'll let you read this one, Alan.
He started by saying that he loves the show, and he said he started working with OpenBSD as a direct result of listening to the show and having been impressed with the whole approach to security compared to Linux. He says suddenly security on Linux feels like an afterthought. It does have a bunch of questions, though. The endorsed method of patching RADA on OpenBSD requires patching and building from source, with the implication that the machine needs both source code and a compiler. He says this is obviously fine with the average desktop, but I do wonder about the wisdom of leaving compilers on production servers. I hear this one a lot. It's an old, silly thing. Back in the day, it was considered good security practice, remove compilers so people couldn't compile code to run an exploit or whatever. But nowadays, it's not hard for people to get access to a similar system.
Sure.
Anybody can spin up a VM, run OpenBSD, compile their code, their exploit, and then copy it to the machine and to work.
Yeah.
It made sense to maybe disable access to the compiler when it was a mainframe and no one else had one like it, and the users didn't have access to another machine. But nowadays, there's basically no.
Not sure what that's buying you.
There's no security benefit at all to not having a compiler. I think Paul Honeycamp had a good discussion about this, because Varnish uses a compiler because its config file is actually its own domain-specific language that gets compiled as a shared object and loaded into Varnish for speed. And somebody was like, well, I don't want to have a compiler on my web server. It's like, you're being silly. He says it would seem that breach mitigation measures such as secure levels and file flags don't offer much protection against an intruder with access to a local compiler. Again, they could compile the binary on a VM of OpenBSD and copy it over, and there would be no difference in the binary work, so that doesn't really help.
Well, and if they've got root at this point to overwrite these files, you're already screwed.
Exactly. Secure levels are in things like that are your best bet because they will prevent, if you make a file immutable, you can't turn that flag off if the secure level is turned up. And if that flag can't be turned off, that file cannot be overwritten. And, if you turn it up certain levels, they can't modify the firewall, they can't raw access the disk, they can't do anything. And that's, how you want it. And he says, how do OpenBSD sysadmins handle things like this? But yeah, the system is useless without a compiler. So, that was always my biggest complaint about using people's Linux boxes when I went to, set up a web server someplace. Like, what do you mean you don't have a compiler?
Yeah, what the heck?
Yeah. And he says he's wondering if we have a tutorial on setting up a hardened prosody server. I don't even know what that is.
Is he talking?
It needs
He didn't misspell proxy, did he?
No, that doesn't. Yeah. So I don't know what that is and why it would need
hardening. It's an XMPP server written in Lua.
Okay.
Just looked it up.
So what do you want to harden about it? If you put it into chroot with nothing else, that's a start.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about it. I've never used it. So.
You'd have to ask a more specific question. All right.
Cool. All right. Well, that takes care of our weekly feedback and questions. So as we close up the show, of course, we want to mention that the tutorial we did and everything we've done in the past are going to be posted in their entirety at bsdnow.tv. We want to give a special thank you to our viewer, Lars, for writing most of today's tutorial and sending it in. So appreciate that, Lars. That's very helpful. Yeah. And of course, send your questions, comments, show ideas, topics, or stories you want mentioned on the show to feedback@bsdnow.tv. That way we can make sure we all see it and can take the appropriate action. Yep. So, of course, if you want to come on for an interview or have a tutorial you'd like to see, let us know. If you're doing something interesting in the community using BSD in a unique way or doing a neat piece of development, I mean, big or small, just shoot us an email. Let us know so we can see about getting it on the air where you can tell us what you're doing. I think, if one person's doing it, there's going to be others out there interested to hear about it too. Yep. So, of course, you can watch live Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1800 UTC. So if you want to see how we make the show, see some of the stuff that doesn't end up in the final edit, that's the place to be so you can catch it as it happens. So, cool. Anything else you want to mention before we head out, Alan?
Nope. Just stay tuned for the tutorial.
Okay, cool. Well, if you're watching live, we'll be back to the tutorial in just a moment. With many people running BSD as firewalls and routers this day, naturally, many are going to have SSHD running on them. So that means they can be used as a gateway to machines behind them. If it's a one-off occurrence, then the connection information only needs to be specified on the command line. But if it's done more frequently, it can be set in the user's or system's SSH config. Doing so only needs a port open for SSH and no further per-destination modification of the firewall rules. So without further ado, Alan's going to show us how we would set this up.
Sometimes to connect to a secure server that's on a private network, you need to connect through an intermediate server first, usually called a bastion host. Generally, the way this works is there'll be a server at the edge of the protected network, and that's the only machine that will accept connections from outside. And so you connect to that machine, and then through that machine, if you have an account there, you'll be allowed to access the internal machine. So you can do that with SSH using the proxy command option. So if you just do SSH, and we'll do proxy command equals, and basically what we'll do is SSH to the indicated host on the indicated port. And we'll just log into that bastion host. And then we can log into the server that was only accessible from that bastion host. So here we're logging into the bastion host called Nexus. And then it's helping us log into the private machine called Trooper. And we're in. Now, that's a bit of a long command, hard to remember, messy. So if you look in your .ssh directory and make a config file, you can make options. So we can give a short name to our thing, define its IP address and the username to use, and the proxy command to use. Or you can even do things like host key alias. If there's multiple different addresses that match, connect to a certain machine, you can end up with multiple of those entries in your known host files. By using the host key alias, you can say, look for the key to match this name in the file and consolidate them so you only have one entry for that server. It makes it much easier and prevents those false positives of, why haven't I already accepted this key before? And you can also use it to do other stuff. So, to show that that works now, if we just SSH to trooper, did I spell it wrong? Yes, I did. There we go. We can see we get the login for the first one, and the log one for the second one. And we're done. If you look at the example on the website, you can see you can also specify different keys to use. If I had RSA keys set up here on this machine, then my login to the Nexus machine can be automated. But you can also, in the config file, specify the file name of the key to use on the Nexus machine to get to the Trooper machine, or to the Bastion host to get to the final host, right? And that way you can say, in this example here, you're logged in as Fred on the client machine. You then log in as Fred2 with onto the jump host or the Bastion host, the intermediate machine, and read the file, the RSA key that's saved on that Bastion host, and then use that to log in as Fred3 on the server. And so you can see that your username doesn't have to match all the way through, and you can save all this in the config file so that you don't have to type, your 3 different usernames and your your 3 different keys, and the fact that, oh, I'm using this internal IP address to access this host, but in the known host file it's listed as this public name instead, and so on. And it saves you all that hassle. You can also set up recursive chaining. You can actually set it up so you SSH to host1/host2/host3, and it'll go through all of them and do all of that fun stuff. You can also have a default. You can do host */*, and you can set that up so that, for example, you might have a setup where, in order to connect to any host, if you're on the secure server and it can't reach the internet, it's not allowed by the firewall, you can say, if I want to SSH out, let's SSH to the Bastion host, and then from there we can reach out to whatever server I need to. Also, this works for all of the commands that use SSH. So if you're using rsync, SCP, SFTP, whatever, it all just works. And you're good to go. They even have a really complicated example with a bunch of shell script in the proxy command, and you can actually do complicated stuff like SSH to user1 equals host1 plus user2 equals host2 colon, whatever the port of host2 is, plus host3 colon this port, etc., and chain them all together in order to get through whatever kind of setup you need to in order to reach your final destination, or to obscure where you're coming from, whatever you need to do. It's an interesting setup, and I definitely am interested in even just learning about the config file itself and being able to find short names for hosts and setting a default username and so on. So yeah, that's it for our tutorial. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next week.